Thanks, Bernard. So, can I borrow that one there? Yeah, thanks.
Jeez, must I pour you water as well? I mean,
No, it's good, it's good.
Do you want water?
No. Yeah, yes, please, thank you.
You know, once a CEO, always a CEO. I mean.
Firstly, great to be here, and thank you, Bernard. Ladies and gentlemen, every industry needs a Bernard Swanepoel, a provocateur, someone that tells it like it is most of the time, and someone that continues to give back to the industry, and certainly someone that I think has made a real difference both to South Africa, and in fact, the global mining industry. And again, cheers, Bernard, and to Paula and the team, thank you again for the hard work you've done in making Bernard look reasonably good. Ladies and gentlemen, it is very much a privilege to be here. I struggled a bit with the topic, and as I said to Bernard, there are, for me, three obvious points that one thinks about when thinking about minerals in Africa. Firstly, Africa is home to 40% of the world's natural resources. It remains the most underexplored of the temperate continents, being around 30%. I actually went to a Silicon Valley session last week on copper, and one of the focal points was Africa, and the talk about the opportunities in Africa, and the Silicon Valley people looking for copper were saying, who's going to help develop Africa? And I said, well, you might start with the Africans, because they've got a pretty good idea of what they need to do, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But one of the comments was, we don't need charity, we need capital, we need support to develop the potential the continent has, and I think that's the key point that we need to make. And I think that the African continent and the people on the African continent are making a significant difference, and I'll use some old slides from my Anglo days to demonstrate what's possible in terms of Africans driving change in the business, and I think that's a really important point to make. And consistent with that, Africa's age demographic is its probably greatest opportunity. If you look at the rest of the world, we're all getting older, like me, but if you look at Africa, I think it's half the continent will be under 14 years of age in the next couple of years. And that age demographic, or don't underestimate the importance of that age demographic. The real question is, how do we take advantage of that? And I think we've all got a role to play in helping build both health and education infrastructure. But for me, these are compelling points to start with. So in making those points, I think there are a couple of other things that need to be said that add to that story, but also provide a point of reflection that I think most people miss. In terms of, in the last 20 to 30 years, Africa has delivered some of the best operating performance improvements across the global mining industry. And that's in a continent that has infrastructure challenges. It has a range of social challenges, not the least of which we've contributed to over the last 100 to 200 years, and certainly Africans are actually turning that story around. But a really important point to make is people don't hear the good stories, they tend to focus on the bad stories. So I'd like to make sure we focus on what we believe are the really positive points that demonstrate where the continent is going. As a second point, we haven't done a good job in promoting our industry and therefore the importance of mining on a global basis. And therefore Africa doesn't get the credit and in fact isn't recognised as one of the key contributors to the transformation of the globe over the next 50 years. I used to talk about Asia 20 to 30 years ago as being the century of Asia. And I remember when I first went to Africa, and after the first year with Anglo Gold Ashanti, I said, no, this is Asia's half century. The second half of this century will be Africa's century. And today I'm more convinced that that is a case. And if we together as an industry can work with our partners both at a government level and in our local communities, I think we can make a real difference in helping that dream become a reality and do something very special, both for the continent, but even more importantly for the globe, in terms of transitioning and dealing with a whole range of issues that confront all of us in terms of the challenges that we face. The key point and the key discussion point for me in many of these conversations has to be around capital and the understanding that capital follows returns, not returns follow capital. It's the other way around. And Jim Rutherford made that statement in this forum or in the Joburg forum a few years back, and I think never a truer word said. And the important conversation we have to have both with governments and for those that are investors that want to know that we understand the importance of delivering returns, those points are really critical. Consistent with that point, if you look at the industry and if you look at the great assets on a global basis, I wrote down a list of great assets in great industries. In the gold industry, the Witwatersrand Basin, PGMs, Mogalakwena and Amanda Belt, and congratulations, Craig, on the big coming out party a week ago, and good to see you here at the moment. I am a shareholder, by the way. Diamonds, Zhuaneng, Orapa, Venetia, copper, the Zambian copper belt, Kamoa, Tenkefungurumi, chrome, the South African assets in chrome, manganese, Samancor, iron ore, Sishen, Simandu, and I saw some Zanaga people here earlier today. Coal, the coal assets of South Africa, fertilisers, Morocco, rare earths in South Africa and Namibia. My point about the potential in Africa, not only are we home to 40% of the world's natural resources, we also host some of the great mining deposits of the world. And in that context, they are top decile assets that change the shape of the cost curve. The fact that we've only explored 30% of the continent tells me that there is so much more potential in Africa compared to the rest of the globe. When I was sitting in Silicon Valley talking to people who are worried about where copper is going to come from, I said, look no further than Africa. The question is, how do we get investment? How do we convince the US not to put money as a government, but maybe even if they get the banks to support or provide insurance for loans in areas where they're worried, so that we can get the investment to keep the industry moving forward? Because I think in most cases, not all, but in most cases, you've got very supportive governments that are starting to work out that business has to be done differently. And I'll quote a few players that I met last week from the DRC and other countries that are rethinking their own industry, and I think it's a really important sign for the continent. In terms of performance and businesses, if you look at Anglo American's performance over a few years, a really important point to make is more than almost 60% of Anglo Americans' operating performance or operating contributions came from African operations. And the doubling of productivity in the business is an African story. Africans delivered the most significant improvement in operating performance from a major diversified company. That's an African story. It can be done, it has been done. And to go from 160,000 employees to 90,000 employees and produce more product hasn't been done anywhere. And again, when we went through that restructuring and that work, every one of our governments supported us. We negotiated the pathway to achieve those outcomes. And I saw no better support from governments from Africa than I've seen in any other continent across the globe. And we were all around the globe. And again, if you treat people with respect, you look them in the eye and treat them with dignity and respect, they will support where you're going as long as they know that the long-term outcome is something that they can benefit from, along with shareholders, along with employees, along with local communities. And that's the key point to make. So again, I'm an unashamed torch and banner holder for South Africa because of what I've seen and what I've been involved in and the support I've seen from a country. In terms of unit operating costs, I'll show how we compared to our much more significant rivals at the time, where we overtook most of the key players in terms of operating performance. Our operating costs dropped 40% over 9 years, 30% during the major restructuring, then a continuous operating improvement that no one else in the industry achieved. Again, that's an African story. And it was replicated in South Africa, in Botswana, in Zimbabwe and other parts of Africa, and it's key to understand that Africa, when given the opportunity, backed with some investment, will deliver. When we started the restructuring work at Anglo, we were operating at around the 49th percentile. So this chart just shows the top 5 mining companies and where their operating costs were in 2012. So we aggregated all of the cost positions across the major diversifieds. Anglo was at the 49th percentile, and the best performer was at the 27th percentile. In going through the change, which included introducing industrial operating practices to each of our mines. So we took the best of the automobile sector and introduced a whole range of new operating practices that went with new mining strategies. And we moved from the 49th percentile to the 29th percentile. Operating costs dropped 40%. We doubled our margins over that same period. Now, the key point to make, in continuing that performance improvement, as I showed against that 40% change, it's continuous improvement on mining strategy, on cost reduction, and the headwinds program, where you look at each ore body and make adjustments to the way you're developing and operating that mine on an annual basis to keep driving your costs down. Absolutely key. So the technical inputs, the innovation is absolutely key in driving continuous improvement. And so when you look at all of that work and you say, okay, but did it matter? Well, it mattered to shareholders. In the period 2013 to 2015, we went through a pretty tough period, recovering from the Minas Rio investment, the worst commodity squeeze that we'd seen in 50 years. But going forward, and because we'd taken 40% out of our costs, we then outperformed the industry for 7 years running. The 22% return I talk about that Anglo delivered was from 2013 to 2022. It actually delivered a 60% average annual return from 2016 to 2022. So from that perspective, again, African operations, African-run assets outperformed the globe. We have a track record as a continent of delivering. And if you look at the good work, whether it's Sibanye, whether it's the platinum operations that Craig is now leading, those results can be delivered. If you look at the good work that Bernard and his team did at Harmony and continue to do, they were challenging operations at 3,000 to 4,000 metres depth. No one else in the world could be successful at those depths. That was done in South Africa. Special skills, performance, delivery of skills or delivery of outcomes that no one else could achieve. I think the other point to make when we look at relative performance, in engaging with governments and local communities, that's the key to making sure that both relationships and the outcomes work. People said, wasn't it difficult? You started off with a 40% discount against your peers. Well, when we sat and worked with our governments in each of those jurisdictions, we explained the issues, we took on board the points that they made, and we walked through how we'd restructure and deliver ongoing performance improvement. It was a partnership with governments, it was a partnership with employees, and it was a partnership with local communities. You can't shortcut those processes. And at the end of the day, for us to be successful and for Africa to be successful, all of us have to do the work with those groups in making sure that we're taking everybody forward together. And finally, in a world when resources are becoming harder to find and where we have 40% of the world's natural resources, it's not a matter of if or maybe, it's how. And the conversation and the focus has to be, how do we help build Africa together based on what we understand works? In that context, I listened to a great presentation last week from Moses Ngadu, Secretary General of the African Mining Strategy Group. He declared, and I quote, "Africa doesn't need charity. Africa needs capital to develop its potential. You don't trust us, and we don't trust you." And we've got lots of history to demonstrate we're on the right side of that equation or that discussion. If you come to make a quick buck, we'll take your money. But if you come to invest in good faith, we will work as partners with you to deliver special outcomes. And he meant it. And I think it was one of the best speeches I've heard. And not only did he talk about the nature of the relationship and how we have to work together, he also made some really positive points on how we can do this together. Moses pointed out that only 1.8% of US venture capital funds invest in Africa. They understand that that must change, and to change those numbers, they have to do things differently. In Zambia, the country is currently undertaking the world's most extensive airborne geophysical survey, and in 2 years, they will have the world's most comprehensive geophysical database. Another African country taking bold steps to change their development arc, and they are building the new Africa. As we develop resources, the allocation of development funds and support for local infrastructure will be key, as it will be for health and education. Building that infrastructure that will build the continent. And the beneficiaries will be us as investors in terms of those sort of productivity numbers and that support from investors. The other context, or the other contextual piece, is the conversation around the geological data information. There are only two countries in the world, two countries in Africa that currently make their geological survey data open to the world. Malawi is the first, and I believe Nigeria is the second. I would ask, and this is a plea, every country in Africa, if you want investment, open source your geological survey data. Allow it to be transparent and demand value for access to your resources and make it an open conversation. And it also deals with the perception of corruption at the same time. We have to be open, we have to be transparent, and we have to take these issues on in full view. And when it's done, I have no doubt it'll be successful for all those concerned. And that was a conversation we had regarding the DRC and other nations who are considering making this big step. And it is a big step, and I encourage those that are there, and I congratulate Malawi and others, and I encourage the rest of the continent. And by the way, this is a plea across the globe. If you want transparency, if you want competitive tension in vying for capital to deliver on the resources we need to run the world, these are the sort of processes that we have to put in place, and we're starting to see it. And that, I think, is great news for Africa, and I'm very excited by the potential. And when you had a group of Africans lecturing or talking to Silicon Valley people about where copper will come from in the future, and they looked at the grade of the deposits, that's a conversation to behold. And I think that's the moment we're at. That's the potential we have. And again, I think it is an exciting time. And I hope we're on the cusp of something very special. And as Bernard said, there's no such thing as critical minerals. They're all critical. Depending on the time and place, supply, demand, it moves around. So iron ore is critical, copper is critical, nickel is critical. They all have their time. It's understanding the cycles and investing for the long term to deliver on your potential, and we've got the potential.
Ladies, gentlemen, Mark Cutifani. So those who know how much wine we drank last night will understand this small oversight. You should go on to Slido and put your questions to the speaker, which you didn't do. Bad audience. You didn't do that. But fortunately, I've got a lot of questions for Mark. So why don't you put a few questions? It will come to me. Mark, in the meantime, I would like to unpack. So I've got a very bad ring feed here. Is it only me? I want to put two questions to you. The issue of capital. And we can abuse Jim Rutherford because he's an audience. Capital will follow returns. But in the world, not all capital expect the returns that Jim Rutherford expects. Chinese capital is different. National capital's incentives, even the IRA scheme, is different. So how is this capital complex issue playing out in a fair way where an African country doesn't have to come to London, capital markets, but can perhaps go somewhere else? Just expand a little bit on capital as the source of funding for mining in Africa.
So the first point I would make in terms of who's willing to invest, whether it be China, the US. I was addressing a group of bipartisan senators in the US, and they were discussing the Chinese approach. And I said, well, to be blunt, there are many in Africa who actually don't like the Chinese approach from a local community perspective, jobs, but I said they make one point. At least they're willing to invest. So until the US, and I said that to the senators, unless you're willing to invest, China's going to beat you every time. Now, if you're investing, you have an opportunity to invest in the right places. You have an opportunity to support infrastructure. You have an opportunity to support education, health facilities, and we've seen some of those new investors come into countries. And I said, if you demonstrate you're there for the long term and you're a true partner to that country, then you'll get a return. And if that means you want offtake, then that's part of the negotiation. But as long as it's not the quick buck, because the point that I made about the quick buck was, yeah, we've had too many fly-by-nighters come in looking to make a quick buck, and if somebody's looking to make a quick buck, we'll pick their pockets. But in terms of that competitive behaviour, there's an opportunity. In terms of access to capital, my point about US financial institutions providing the government, and I said this to the government, if you provide support to US financial institutions and provide them some insurances in areas where maybe the politics aren't yet as mature as they could be, then that would be a far smarter way to support investment in Africa, leaving it to the banks to support who they should, but provide them with a backup as the politics mature. So there are different ways, I think, that capital can be brought in, but I think countries that want the offtake need to be prepared to back investments in a way that the market will then perform as it should.
And of course, it gets even more complicated when you go midstream and upstream and beneficiation, because then you are in direct competition with China.
So I have a different view there.
Absolutely. You and I never agree. So let's hear the wrong view. I mean, the other view now.
Well, so one of the things that I thought was quite important, if you go back to when Cyril led the Planning Commission work under President Zuma. And when they looked at the role of the mining industry, the thing that came back very strongly was the most significant benefit from mining investments occurred when we were putting money in the ground and developing primary mines to concentrate.
Absolutely, yeah.
They said when we were investing in smelters and refineries, big capital licks for very small returns, and because we were still developing skills and also we didn't have low-cost power, it was very difficult to be competitive at that back end. And the conclusion was, and I've seen this in many other countries, it would have been better to take that investment and invest in alternate commercial activities around those communities instead of the refinery and the smelter, because the return to the local communities was very small. So I would argue that in Africa, I think you have to be very careful. This is a broader statement, it's more than Africa. If you're developing an industry and you need that infrastructure, you're better off in the primary mining assets, build a critical mass before you start to go downstream. But I've also said to the Saudis, you should be doing deals in Africa where they get a better slice of the downstream returns for a longer offtake, and then in Africa you can decide at what point you then start committing to downstream when you've got the energy and the infrastructure that supports a competitive facility. So everybody says we want everything. I was in Riyadh and every country wanted all downstream investment, and I said none of us can operate many of those assets. So let's think about how we invest our money and build that broader infrastructure base. I think that's a better return in the short term, and then longer term go downstream.
I'm going to quickly unpack another comment you make, is we should all follow the countries that make their geological data available. Obviously, in order to make the geological data available, are you saying only the ones the government generate, or also the ones that the company may have generated, and when it relinquishes its mining rights, should that data also be reverting back to the state? I mean, it's a big topic of discussion right now, is once you relinquish your mining right, what happened to the data?
So, as a point of principle, the rules should be set when you invest. So you know that if you don't do something within a certain time frame, it reverts back to the state. So that should be clear and transparent. And I think that data should be made available unless there's some other deal that's been done. But I'd prefer to see it be transparent, because it will then force people to do something, use it or lose it. And I think the principle's important, but the transparency point needs to be understood up front. Now, I don't agree with the Russian practice of you doing the exploration and then it going back into a jackpot and you bid for the asset. I think that's unreasonable.
Yeah.
Because we've got to reward exploration, we've got to reward risk-taking, but at the same time, there's got to be a period where you get control of that information back to the state if you're not prepared to do it. You can't sit on the resources forever.
So, for some reason, I'm not getting the questions. They momentarily appeared on the screen. But the one question that I thought would be very interesting is, somebody asked a question about the magic wand, Cutifani magic wand. What is the one thing that you would like to see, and I'm sorry to say Africa, but the African continent, what's the one thing you would like the African continent to do to make mining more successful?
Invest in its people. Period.
But talk to us about your great tsunami. Expand a little bit on your thinking about the generational skills challenges, if you don't mind.
Well, I've been involved, since retiring, I've been involved, well, in Anglo, when we did our asset review back in 2013-14, we found a lot of our assets had been let go from a mining strategy point of view and an operating efficiency point of view. So it provided a starting point for us to restructure. And you would say, coming from the base we had, it was easy to improve our productivities. Yes, it was. But when we look across, and we're doing asset reviews across the globe, we're seeing consistent evidence of mining strategies that haven't been fully thought through. We see the industry still slow on industrial efficiency work, maintenance, operating processes, automobile-type processes in the industry. Lots of opportunity, and we're losing the experienced engineers. And so I think that's being lost, and either people are being retrenched or they're leaving too quickly. So I think it's important that we keep people, we support young people, and there's a gap that we're seeing. And the question is, how do we make, and getting young people, I mean, half the mining schools in the world were starting to close. It looks like we've reopened Camborne. We've done a job to keep Wollongong open. There are university schools that are closing. We've got to get young kids into the industry and help them understand why mining is the most significantly environmental positive, net positive industry on the face of the planet. And nobody understands that point. And that's a starting point in terms of kids with purpose and what they want to do with their lives. If you join our industry, you'll make a real difference. And helping them understand what that looks like, I think, is key. So the grey tsunami and not getting the young kids in, two major problems. We need to sort of slow this up and get more kids in the front end.
Ladies, gentlemen, Mark Cutifani, thank you very much.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.
Thank you.